Hello, and welcome to the South Coast Artists Index, where artists, performers, and writers, as well as curators, directors, and supporters, anyone with ties to the creative community, drops by to introduce themselves to you. We'll talk about their beginnings, their vision, their passion, and so much more. The South Coast Artist Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere. Learn more at heavenlyspirits.com.
Hi, this is Ron Fortier with another episode of the In Focus podcast, brought to you by the South Coast Artist Index and graciously supported by Heavenly Spirits Imports. And we have, by this time, already gone over 100 podcasts, which is quite a milestone. And we haven't even scratched the surface. We haven't scratched the surface on the living artists, or what we refer to as contemporary artists, which is a whole nother discussion about people getting confused with the word contemporary, and the historical artists, which is more accurately the dead artists, which is not really a good term to use, but we are trying to record the living and the dead using their interlocutors to give us their information. So as I do at every podcast, I'd like to have our guests introduce themselves and spell their name, because that's always very, very useful for the historic record. And with that, go right ahead.
Hello. Yeah, thank you so much for that this opportunity, Ron. My name is Rebecca Uchill. My name is spelled REBECCAUCHILL. I am a member of the faculty in art history at UMass Dartmouth, CVPA, and I'm here speaking with you today because I'm the curator of the exhibition Nancy Holt, Massachusetts, which opened yesterday at the time of our recording, November 11th, 2021, in the UMass Dartmouth galleries.
That was quite an event. I didn't have a chance to go to the CVPA Star Store location, but I did obviously show up on campus. And I always get the warm and fuzzies. I graduated from there with my BFA in 1975. The place has always been near and dear to my heart, that's for sure. Tell us a little bit more about Nancy Holt. And I don't know why. I mean, I have a relatively good memory, but for the weirdest reason, I always thought one of Harvey Goldman's sculptures was in the exact site. But then again, maybe it was temporary, because at one point, I think we had a lot of temporary sightings of sculptures. And then we moved on. But Nancy Holt was an amazing person and artist. Tell us a little bit about her.
Yeah, well, Nancy Holt is an artist who has such a storied and extensive career that it could take us the duration of the podcast, I think, even to try to scratch the surface of describing her artistic story. She's very likely best known, at least in the current moment, for her large-scale outdoor sculptural work, responsive to land and the environment, most notably her artwork, Sun Tunnels. But her career spanned every medium of her time, from concrete poetry to video art, installation. She was a really important thinker, I think, about the ways that art responds to its environment and contexts, including its systems. And one of the artworks on view as part of this exhibition is one of her systems artworks, and we can talk about that a little bit more. But Nancy Holt is a person of interest to me for many art historical reasons, but probably to our region for some very specific and local reasons. One of which, of course, being that her artwork, Spinwinder, which you made allusion to moments ago, stands at our campus entrance. It was completed in 1991 as part of the Massachusetts Art in Public Places 1% for Art program. So it was constructed using a percentage of the budget allocated for the Dion building, the science building's construction. As it happens, her artwork responded to a prompt asking artists to consider making allusion to local industrial histories, including the history of the maritime industry and the textile industry. And Nancy Holt's grandfather was a New Bedford-based practitioner within the textile industry. And in fact, he was the director or the head, he had different titles over time, of the designing and weaving department for the New Bedford Textile School. Nancy Holt also made other artworks about her relationship with her Aunt Ethel, who lived in the home that Samuel Holt had occupied at 39 Locust Street. So Nancy Holt is someone who allows us, as you said in your thoughtful introduction, to think about many different inroads into the historical past, and also as an artist whose work was so boundary defying, really remains so contemporary for us. As problematic, I agree, as that term may be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. People always confuse it with, modern. Well, let's not even get into what modern means, because that's a whole other story. It just keeps getting more convoluted as we move on.
I teach a class periodically at UMass Dartmouth called Multiple Modernisms, where we dig into that, and that takes us a full semester, and we still don't finish telling that story. So that'll be another podcast sequence, perhaps.
Exactly. Yeah, modern is now. That's what modern is. How did she come to the university? Was she Spinwinder obviously was at the top of her list of achievements, but how did she come to the university? Was she on faculty?
Yeah, I think, I'm just delighted to hear you say that, Ron, because I think that Spinwinder, I agree, is a really important artwork for Nancy Holt biographically. And it was very interesting in yesterday's events. Ron and I were both at the Nancy Holt Massachusetts Symposium, which I hope we may have a chance to talk about a little bit more, where we had historians, curators, artists, park rangers, foundation directors, thinkers, and most importantly, in some respects, people who really knew Nancy Holt in her life, including good friends, collaborators, and curators who worked with her very closely, some of whom corroborated my feeling that Spinwinder may be among her most personal artworks in some respects. It certainly has a real kind of biographical, familial story behind it. And the Star Store exhibition that's open right now, I made mention of Nancy Holt's artworks about her Aunt Ethel, but the Star Store exhibition digs into that history a little bit more robustly than we're able to do just on the plaque that we've recently installed outside of Spinwinder. But the truth is, Ron, that I would not say that maybe among art historians or even Nancy Holt biggest fans, I'm not sure that Spinwinder would have been counted among her highest achievements. I do hope that the kind of thinking that we're doing about Spinwinder can help to restore its significance to a kind of appropriate place. She came to the university, though, because we had a % for art program. So the Massachusetts legislature had established a program that would allocate a portion of budgets from state construction buildings for artworks. And the program folded in 1991. And to my knowledge, it's been, doing art history during a pandemic and having a lot of problems of access to archives is a whole other tangle to dig into. But there's at least one notation somewhere that indicates that this was in fact the last of the artworks completed for that program. So the program folded in 1991, but artists would just apply to be part of this program. And her proposal was selected, not necessarily because she had that family history. That was simply, an additional kind of augmented benefit in some ways of her application and her return to the region to create this work.
It's, to me, just reading her biography and seeing the work, there's a Portuguese word that's it's a very squishy, wiggly word. It's saudades. It's a longing for something, and I think my estimation, because as Gombrich said, the beholders share. It lit a lot of things up. My family, the French Canadian side, came down from Canada to work in those mills. At one time before my pépère, my grandfather, started his cabinet business. He worked in rayon. My dad worked in cotton, and it was wonderful to hear their arguments. They were so proud of what they did. My dad was a trainee instructor. He said he taught half the immigrants in the city how to weave. But as I was telling one individual yesterday, I believe Stacy Lott Savage is the chair of the sculpture department.
And the artist who produced the 350-50 sculpture, which is really in very interesting proximity to Nancy Holt's Spinwinder. Mm-hmm.
Right within view of it.
Yeah.
So there's almost like a spiritual connection between the two, and how she was in awe, like, oh my gosh, this is, you're going to be in the same environs as your hero. But as I was speaking with Stacy, I said, I always wondered. You get two competing cities, one the spindle city, and they were more they probably had more bobbins than anywhere else in the world spinning around, and New Bedford, which was known for its fine cotton lawns and percales, the Wamsutta being the epitome of all fabrics, all cotton fabrics. And I always thought it amazing that these founders, these people got together in a cow pasture in Dartmouth and said, hey, we're going to build a world-class university, a university of the future designed by a world-class architect. It seems, if you were to tell somebody that story without them knowing that it actually exists, they probably would look at you and say, in Dartmouth? Mm. It just doesn't tack to any reality, I guess, of sorts. But I think it was quite forward-thinking, futuristic, so on and so forth. So with all that in mind, and seeing her sculpture, it also brought back memories. I remember going with my dad to Berkshire Hathaway and nearly seeing him get killed by a flying shuttle. The shuttle went right by his ear and landed in a column, and he hardly flinched. He's like, oh, that happens all the time. But, all of this, and that's what art does. It becomes a touchstone, I think. And so I don't want to wax poetic over it, but so I'll just let you go back there to it. But it did touch me. It did touch me.
Thank you. Yeah. I am familiar with that term. I think I dated a Brazilian Portuguese speaker for a long time, and maybe it's just regional dialects, but I think I heard it pronounced like saudade, like that. Saudade,
yeah. They throw a lot of D's and G's where they don't. Well, it's like as, the lack of as.
Right. But so I am familiar with the concept, and I think that's a really appropriate one, as I understand that sort of wistfulness or nostalgia, maybe for something that like one never even had, or I mean, I'm not a native speaker. I'm just kind of a proxy sort of, appreciator of the poetics of this idea. But the fact of the matter was that, Nancy Holt was someone, look, in life, she was married to and the artistic partner of one of arguably the most sort of like famous, prominent, land environmental conceptual artists of his moment, Robert Smithson. And Robert Smithson died an untimely death. Nancy Holt's parents died also when she was very young, within just a matter of a year or two, a few years of each other. And while she was an artist known for doing massive public works and working very closely, and I mean very intimately, with the construction laborers who worked on her projects. I mean, for example, the stonemason Al Pointer, who worked with her on two of her works, she did extensive, hours and hours and hours of recorded interviews and transcripts with him. In fact, as I argue in a chapter that's coming out in a book published by Western Washington University and Bruna Press, I believe that Al Pointer's influence actually changed the title of her artwork, Stone Enclosure, Rock Rings. So, I mean, she's a hefty lifter, tough, in the dirt, out in remote places. Two of the speakers last night at the event at the Star Store remembered going in different incidents out to the desert to look at Holt's sun tunnels with her. And in both cases, getting lost. In one case, Holt had to go to the emergency room because her lips were black, after sleeping over in the desert and sort of getting lost, having no water with them. So, I mean, she's a tough person, and maybe known for these kind of like large scale, highly ambitious projects, but, still very much like a human, and maybe someone who, in the absence of her family members, maybe did have that feeling of a wistfulness or desire to like resuture family connections, maybe some of which weren't even really so close to begin with. And in some ways, that actually is the argument of this exhibition. So Nancy Holt's connection to Massachusetts, I argue in this exhibition, and in the booklet that accompanies the exhibition. I'm not sure if you had a chance to grab one, but it's around somewhere. Beautifully designed, I should add, by Michelle Bowers from our graphic design faculty. And I also, while I'm doing this, our core team with Allison Sywin, Vera Levitt, and Shingo Furukawa, huge thanks for the massive heavy lifting that went into the exhibition. In this booklet, I track how Nancy Holt, talks about Massachusetts. She writes about Massachusetts. She writes about Massachusetts in an essay that was commissioned by the DeCordova Museum in 1979 for their exhibition catalog, Born in Boston. And when she describes Massachusetts, a lot of what she describes, not exclusively, but a lot of what she describes is kind of New Bedford. It's like cobblestone streets and like the Seaman's Bethel and, Ryder. We just had that amazing Ryder show that just closed.
Yes, yeah.
So she's thinking about Massachusetts, and she's consolidating Massachusetts kind of into this New Bedford kind of vision. And truthfully, I believe she consolidates that vision into the vision of the house at Locust Street when she describes, and I don't have the essay right in front of me right now, but, she describes the kind of, architectural features or the tchotchkes on the mantelpiece. And then when you look at that against, for example, her video Underscan, in which she takes photographs from her Aunt Ethel's home at Locust Street and then reformats them for the monitor using an overscan and underscan process. It's sort of inserting these sort of degrees of mediation between the viewer and this image. It's sort of being consecrated as being so remote, so hard to access, like it has to be reformatted over and over again. And over the course of this video artwork, she's reading letters from over the course of 10 years of correspondence with Aunt Ethel. where Aunt Ethel's life is sort of narrated in this sequence of cyclical events of, the rumors, the boarders upstairs are moving out. I need a surgery. I've gotten married. My husband has now died. Everything's sort of read with the same kind of flat, monotone, kind of consolidating all of these life events and architectural features of the home into one kind of portrait. Later, of course, and maybe we can talk about this next or soon, the story of Aunt Ethel changes very tragically and dramatically. Right. But when Holt talks about Massachusetts, which she did in interviews, especially, in my research, she really did emphasize this in interviews, in the last decades of her life. She talks about how she corrects, for example, one interviewer who says, "Oh, I think you're from New Jersey. Is that correct?" And she did grow up in New Jersey, but she corrects him. She says, "No, I was born in Massachusetts." She was born in Worcester County, Massachusetts. Her family had a home in Leominster. And as Holt tells this, and she tells it in different ways in different interviews, her family was her father's job, located him in New Jersey, but they never bought a home. She says they only rented because there was this idea that at some point they would be relocated back to Massachusetts. And she puts it differently in different interviews, but she says things like, I had this idea that Massachusetts was a utopia, or Massachusetts was like the promised land. What she definitely says is Massachusetts was a place where my relatives lived. It's kind of like this homestead that she can't quite access. And so this kind of like Xiaojiaji, this idea of like a home that no longer is with her, or that she can't quite access, I think is, really.
I feel that completely, because we have our family homestead in Quebec, in the Gaspé, up in Quebec. We can sit, and we can do a virtual tour in our heads, and it gets very, very emotional. It's a place you can never go back to, but you're connected, but disconnected. And her thing about systems and so on and so forth, I think it's all very, very, very interesting. I mean, she was a passionate, feeling person.
Right.
A lot of times you see work that hits, the top of the market, for recognition and so on and so forth. And it's just, I don't know, there's that I don't know, it's even though it's three-dimensional, it's one-dimensional, but not with her. I mean, there's so much history that's connected to it.
No, her work is so profound. I actually was just today in the middle of this horrible storm. I visited, I probably shouldn't say this on the podcast, but I'll say it anyway. Because the Wellesley College campus is officially closed right now, but we walked onto the campus very briefly to visit her wild spot. And I was just really struck by just how every one of her artworks that you encounter just brings so much forth. But this kind of distance, I did find a quote that I thought I might read really quickly, and then we could move on to systems works, perhaps, if you like. But this is an interview with James Meyer, in which she says, in those days, if you lived in New Jersey and all the relatives lived in Massachusetts, you hardly ever saw each other. Of course, I knew they existed from hearing about them, and I knew they were connected with me through blood, but the relationship was at a distance, and some of that distance ended up in my work. And so, when we see in Underscan the kind of hypermediation of these photographs or the letters, or in subsequent works where she actually took a still frame from the film and then mediated it even one time more in a work she called her facsimile work, that kind of distancing effect. And she talks about distance and distancing effects in her built works and her constructed works. So when you start to think about that tangle of like the familial distance, the homestead distance, what it really is to site yourself or pin yourself or root yourself to a place, and think about that in terms of her massive and growing figure within the world of land art and site-specific artworks, it adds a kind of, as you say, sort of a human dimension to the work that is really unique and totally hers.
Yeah, there's something. I mean, when you consider she's using cold steel, a bunch of other materials that aren't exactly warm and fuzzy. In the sculpture, unless it's marble and the whole classic thing, um, it, it it's unusual that this passion of hers comes through. I'm thinking right now of uh, Uriz das Palavras, Amadeo de Prado, The Night Train to Lisbon. It's a wonderful, wonderful book, and it's so convincing that people actually think that Amadeo de Prado actually lived. And Andrea Pavel, who I believe was the who wrote the book, um, just brings it, let me see if I can find this one quote because it really, we live here in the here and now. It's Pascal Mercier. That's what it is. Oh, we live here and now. Everything before and in other places is past and mostly forgotten. What should be done with all the time that lies ahead of us, open and unshaped, featherlight in its freedom, and lead heavy in its uncertainty? It is a wish, dreamlike and nostalgic, to stand once again at that point in life and to be able to take a completely different direction to the one which has made us who we are. And this is just like one of his, I mean, they're so bloody profound. And when you were speaking of that popped into my head like right away, that she, and it's funny I mentioned the word saudades before because, or saudades, with the Brazilian dialect. She so much as a child, I think, wanted to connect to these people. She wanted to connect to these places, but circumstances didn't allow. And even back then, I mean, a long distance phone call, I mean, we don't even use that term, long distance phone call. That was expensive.
Right, right. And so these letters, that's right. So like this sort of remote, I mean, I guess we've become unfortunately so accustomed to a kind of remote proximity over this pandemic in a way, but it's not kind of natural to or typical of human history really. And I just think it's so interesting that she talks about this distance and specifically Massachusetts. I mean, it's a distance that's about this region, and that was so important for her work thereafter. I do want to add, though, because I mentioned it before, and I do hope that people will have a chance to see the New Bedford exhibition and the Star. So we have one exhibition about Nancy Holt in the Star Store and one exhibition in the main campus gallery at UMass Dartmouth. And they're both important companion exhibitions that are circling around in different ways. Spinwinder, of course, at our campus entrance. The exhibition at Star Store also includes the artist book Ransacked. And we had a very special opportunity that was afforded to us by virtue of working with the Holt-Smithson Foundation that allowed us to create kind of a spatialized replica of the book so that people can experience the full narrative of this limited edition artist's book and hear the second part of the story about Aunt Ethel, which became, it was a very sad and tragic story, truthfully, where later in life, she suffered from elder abuse, and Nancy Holt was sort of summoned back from working in Bellingham, Washington on stone enclosure rock rings, and came with her friend, the artist Ardell Lister, to New Bedford to kind of check in on Ethel, and discovered this situation. I won't tell the story because Nancy Holt is actually so specific in her book Ransacked about creating a kind of container that tells the story in a very thoughtful and deliberate way. So I'd prefer for the story to unfold in Nancy Holt's words and telling. But a couple of things. Firstly, it is a real New Bedford story. It doesn't begin and end with Nancy Holt and inside of just one house at Locust Street. In fact, at our event last night, one of the daughters of Foster Herman, who was the lawyer who was involved with Aunt Ethel and basically saved Aunt Ethel from this horrible situation, came to the event. And, for her, she remembered the story of these two girls that sort of showed, because Ardell and Nancy Holt were very young at the time, who showed up and were part of this kind of rescue campaign. And of course, had no idea that it had been, memorialized in this artist book, the first artist book, apparently, that was published by Printed Matter, one of the most important artist presses around. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, a really important artwork that, of course, as we know, I mean, art and life are totally connected. And New Bedford is kind of the very important grounds for this work. But these are stories about our community. It's the story. It is a real New Bedford story, and it touched the lives of many people. And it's at the end of that book, Ransacked, that Nancy Holt says about the house, that the house, I'm just going to read in her words, mm-hmm. "This house, which has now been twice the subject of my art, is my physical connection with genes and blood and family history. All the memories of the Holt family reside now only in the house, which has passed into other hands, and in myself, the last member of the family."
Yeah, that's and it's that thing about spaces and places. There's another thing too that was kind of interesting, is that the connectivity. New Bedford evolved from a bunch of people who were asked to leave Plymouth Colony for various reasons, and they found their own niche. They pretty much took over the Nantucket whaling endeavors by their fortitude, by their foresight, by their genius, so on and so forth. And yes, it created this thing where everybody has a whaling ship captain. Everybody wants that connectivity. And for some reason, that seemed to have been the history of the gentry in town. And the mills, no one really spoke about the mill owners as much as they did the mill operatives. But that was the poor's connection to the city. But it was a natural evolution from whaling to textiles, from textiles to apparel. And now I think the heir apparent is the art community. The creative community is now in those buildings and keeping this whole history alive. And so she really had a finger on everything. And again, I think driven by the fact that maybe throughout most of her life, she always wanted to be somewhere else. And, she wanted to be in New Bedford. She wanted to be here. There was this incredible, there's just a small little bits that she had, the little tastes that she had of this area. They say there's a, terroir. You can talk about terroir in various levels, terroir of wine, the terroir of food. But there's also that sense of place. I remember asking my cousin Roland. I said, next time we go up there, I said, I've got to get a bag of dirt, a small bag of dirt. And I said, you probably think it's crazy. And he said, no, we all have one. Why?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, Nancy Holt was very invested in like local materials, and that means not only like, for example, locally sourced stone or cement or concrete fabricated of locally sourced, terroir, so to speak, really. Right. But also, like industrial materials, like the local industrial materials. And so in the electrical system exhibition that's up at the main campus, this is one of her systems artworks. And Nancy Holt's systems artworks are such a fascinating body of work. Also, so rich and so much to be explored there. But these works would look at sort of the infrastructural built environment and call attention to certain features that maybe we, and by we, I mean like modern to contemporary, Western civilization have tended to hide away. So one of my favorite works by Holt, that I'm aware of, but have never seen, and in fact is no longer at this moment, it's not built, it's not extant in that sense, is a work called Catch Basin, in which she was invited to create a work for a public park and sort of responded to a drainage problem, a pool of water that was kind of collecting in the park. And she created this really dynamic drainage system through Catch Basin that it's not a celebration. I mean, she may even have called it a celebration. I'm not sure, but it's not a triumph of the drainage system. It's a functional drainage system that is also kind of aestheticized and built. And I think it sort of is so ingenious that it defies every genre. Like, is it art? Is it infrastructure? Is it a park? Like, where does it begin and end? Like, how much of this park can we think of as being drainage, catch basin rather? This work, and my students and I talk about this too. Like, what do we usually do with our drains? We like hide them, we like embed them, we hide them like a secret, like a dirty secret that we have a drainage system, when in fact it's kind of like a remarkable and necessary thing, at least for like the way that we live now. We could probably do better with our water waste, frankly. But Nancy Holt's electrical system is one of those works. So it's a work that uses bent conduit, sort of spatialized into an immersive electrical installation, to call attention to just the facticity of electricity and electrical systems and electrical circuits that surround us within our building environments. And did you have a chance to see the show?
Yes, I did. I was... I had to be very aware. As I told one of the attendants, I said, I wonder how many of those light bulbs are going to get kicked out by accident, because you're mesmerized by something, and then your feet, you're paying attention to where your feet are, and you might just kick out one of the bulbs. So it kind of makes it dangerous in a way, in a good way. It gets your senses heightened, and you're really paying attention to what's going on. There's another thing too about her work. What was her religious or spiritual background? Because I'm getting like a Zen vibe from her quite a bit.
Well, before we go there, I just want to say though, just back to this idea of the local materials, just really quickly, that for electrical system. Electrical system. Obviously, she's using like the normative materials of bent conduit, but in her time, she was using bulbs with these filaments inside of them that were kind of like typical light bulbs for the contemporary today's installation. And you can imagine that creating a posthumous exhibition of a work that is so site specific, created by an artist that's not alive, means working very closely with the experts at the foundation, who are the people that represent the estate and represent her prerogatives and wishes and her artwork for the present day. And they've been thinking a lot about electrical system in particular, because it was recently installed in Ireland at Lismore, and now this is the first posthumous presentation of it in the U.S. It hasn't been exhibited since 1982. So the light bulbs now are environmentally friendly bulbs, and there's a lot of good reasons to do that. But we did work with these kind of like boutique artsy bulbs that would not be kind of typical normative light bulbs. The ones in her original time might have been a little bit more like that. And so, there's a little bit of interpretation, I guess, that has to happen in her absence now, because she's no longer alive. I mean, everything you sort of speculated before is true, and very thoughtful of you to be, thinking about her relationship to the local and the relationship to the kind of like, like everyday material But what
Right.
does that mean? What about, 200 years from now when like we don't even have light bulbs? I mean, what will that be? How will it be adapted? That's a question for the future.
Right.
To your question about her spiritual practice, this is not something that I personally study about her, so I can speak to it only a little bit, but it is something that there are people that study her spiritual practice or know her well as friends in her life that would be able to say more. She was, I do know that she was an active practicing Buddhist, and that she was very spiritual in her life. And I'm not sure if you were with us yesterday when people talked about a poem that she wrote where she sort of traced during the course of a day her behaviors as a feminist, as a mystic, and as an artist. A conundrum for me, of course, because I'm like, well, it starts to ask a lot of questions about like, can you be all three things at once? I mean, in the graph, you can be once a day, I guess.
Right.
Anyway, sorry, it's a different topic, but
No. I understand completely.
It's a totally interesting question. It's not one that I can speak to
Right.
a lot, but I am sure you're picking up on something in her practice there.
Yeah, and the fact too that George Miller, who was my sculpture teacher there at UMass, who was a phenomenal person. I really didn't appreciate him until years after his death. He saw something in me that I didn't see in me. And then Herb Cummings, who is still, to this very day, he's in the studio right now with me, so to speak, brought the whole Zen thing together. But I really, really felt that in her work, that sense of place, the terroir, the sense of materials. I remember, Herb telling us, some of the Japanese sculptors would go and chain themselves to a tree or tie themselves to a tree because that's the tree that they chose to make their sculpture, and that they wanted the spirit of the tree to know that they were not going to die, that they were going to be transformed from one thing to another thing. And it was very important to feel their energy and so on and so forth. Now, a lot of people might think that that's a bunch of hooey or whatever, but we just put it under the category of process. I mean, and there are people who have process that is just, well, almost not understandable. But I just got a really, really good vibe from her. That's for sure.
Well, the day that we spent yesterday made it easy to get a good vibe. It was really wonderful to have so many people in one place thinking about her work. We had everything from, Ranger Andy Schnetzer, a park ranger, contextualizing her Spinwinder artwork against the backdrop of the New Bedford textile industry to which it makes reference. And for those who didn't see it, I suppose it should be mentioned. The reason why we're talking about it making these references to the textile industry is because its form resembles a machine from the textile industry. And in my opinion, it very closely resembles machinery that was in the knitting studio at the New Bedford Textile School, which is an argument that I draw out a little bit in the exhibition, but also because she embedded artifacts from the New Bedford textile industry in the foundation of the sculpture. But everything from, Ranger Andy, to the electrical engineering students who were involved in adapting electrical system for our campus installation and worked with the Holt-Smithson Foundation on that topic. But, and also Alina Williams, the curator who did the magnificent, life retrospective, sort of end career, as it turned out, retrospective of Nancy Holt's work called Sightlines, which had it not been for Alina Williams organizing this exhibition and this book, I mean, our scholarship and knowledge of Nancy Holt would be so much poorer than it is. She created just an amazing volume and roster of information and reflections on Holt and her work. It's such an incredible thing that she did. But to have all of these people that knew her and worked with her in one room, I think made it really easy to have this feeling. And also people that responded to her, like Stacey Latt Savage with her sculpture, or, young upcoming engineers just graduating from college who chose to work on Nancy Holt's history as their engineering capstone.
Well, I mean, there's another thing too. I mean, from when she was, as they use the term, coming up, it's never been easy for women. It's the multi titles, wife, mother, all those attachments, all those labels, all those tethers, and to be a sculptor, to be an artist. There are other women artists who made it on their own, but there were many as well who were collaborators with their also artist husbands. So there's been a societal shift that's been going on. So probably now I think maybe society's looking at her with fresher eyes than they did. I'm sure, she probably got a bunch of construction worker types who were kind of wondering what the hell, it's like, hey, the money's good,
Well, I mean, I do want to note, I think that I do hope things are changing, but I think it's sadly not unusual that Nancy Holt is having this surge of interest in her work now after her death.
Mm-hmm.
There are Lorraine O'Grady, just had her major exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum. Hilma F. Klimt. I mean, when you really think about women artists who are being celebrated now, it's at the end of or after the end of their lives. So yes, I think things are changing, but in her life, I think it is accurate to say that her career was occluded by the career of her more famous husband, Robert Smithson. And he predated her in death. And of course, she had a longer career and I think an equally, if not more interesting career in many respects. I mean, certainly there were more years of it and more opportunity for it to change. Right. But, she often had to self-subsidize her projects. Smithson would have, big muckety muck gallerists and others, investing in the work. And, Nancy Holt was doing scrappy fundraising and it's sometimes she talks about it and sometimes she doesn't, but it's there. It's like latent under the surface is the fact that she kind of had to hustle. She talks about sun tunnels, for example, as this kind of managerial project, where so you're absolutely right. That leads her. She talks about this in her essay about sun tunnels. It led her into relationships with, like you said, construction workers, for example, that, I mean, there's so much to be said about this. It's almost like dangerous to start getting into this turf here, but let it suffice for now to say that she actually wrote about it, this idea of the extension of herself, through the work, labor, and collaboration of others. And it's complex. It sometimes is even a little uncomfortable for me, I have to say, to think about another human as like the instrument of your desire. Like, is it a person or like a tool? But yes, she was often, and I did not know her in life, but last night we heard from people who did know her very well throughout her artistic career. And she was very often very closely involved with not only the people that worked on the creation of these, massive constructive works, but also like local personalities from, the Cowboy Bar. That's literally the name of the bar at the town, closest town over from Sun Tunnels, for example. And I think she was someone, by all accounts, who was actually really interested in working across like region, class, professional title, and so on and so forth. But I never knew her. I mean, this is anecdotal from what I've heard from others, but a really interesting person to think about in that way.
I mean, it's the other thing too. If you have a strong, independent woman, the B word pops up. because if she's going to take no prisoners, not to be, in other words, holding her ground, holding sway over a situation, there's always that thing that's lingering. It's like with, all of a sudden now African American art is a big thing now. And it seemed to have been on the rise, and then BLM kicked in and really, poured gasoline on that. But I also remember back in grad school when Southwest artists, Fritz Schollander, Garcia, those Native American artists, it was a flash in the pan, unfortunately. It was the thing. Now I think we're seeing much more gender, especially artists, historical artists, dead artists. We're starting to see more. They didn't change, their art didn't change, but society has changed. The values have changed. Culture has changed. Mores have changed. Whatever. The world has changed, but not the work. The work stays the same. It's like I always used to tell my art history students, okay, the Pietà. You've probably seen it a dozen times. Yeah, that's what it is. All right. Have you ever really looked at this? Does it ever ring? It's unfortunate. I had a friend whose son passed away suddenly and tragically in the past couple of weeks. And I remember Gombrich saying, "Look at that face of the Virgin. No parent should suffer this pain of surviving their children." And this is a woman who, by myth, if that's what you want to call a myth, okay, this is a woman who knew this was going to happen, and this is the moment the prophecy came true. I mean, and that it's when you think of it that way, all of a sudden it becomes so poignant. And it's like Spinwinder. You see it, you really don't know the history behind it. Sometimes you do have to have that background brought into the work, I think.
Yeah. Well, we had a really great opportunity, and especially, and I know we should wrap up in a moment, but we had a great opportunity with a grant from the Henry Luce Foundation's American Art Program that was very specifically calibrated to think about collection objects and reinterpretation of collection objects. And we're not a museum, but we have some collection objects, and one of them is Spinwinder. And thinking about how we can understand and interpret this collection object through so many means, I have to say, there's probably, we'll have to leave some ideas on the table here. Right. But this idea that, we may be in a moment of like allowing our histories to expand, like the tent posts of what we allow to be considered part of the canon of art history, to it at minimally, as you say, acknowledge the existence of various viewpoints and positionalities. I think that's like the minimum that can happen, and hopefully a lot of other things can happen in addition to that. But expanding, let's say, different viewpoints and perspectives on one artwork and one artist's contribution to the public art infrastructure of our region, I think is really important. And I'm just so pleased to have been able to share this project with you today. And I hope we can welcome you back
As soon. I tell people, each one of these episodes is just a page. There are guests who have chapters and volumes, and a complete set. As we evolve, it'll be wonderful, especially to later on historians, because all of these episodes are being archived in the Whaling Museum's database. And as Mike Lapides, the digital manager for the Whaling Museums, loves to say, they will be held in perpetuity.
Great.
So that's a fantastic thing. I'm going to wrap it up because this is a subject where the more you speak, the more I get to learn about her, the more I start making connections in my own mind. And there's so much more possibilities on that campus. So many more possibilities. And we have gone from a cult of personalities, unfortunately. And what's unfortunate about that is that those personalities, once they pass on, their legacy just becomes frozen. So if we can have a different kind of culture that allows their drive, their vision to keep going, that would be wonderful. It's very much like Nancy Holt. Any final words?
Come on down, UMass Dartmouth Campus Gallery and UMass Dartmouth Star Story University Art Gallery, now through January 23rd at the University Art Gallery, now through December 10th at main campus, and then select Sundays through January 16th.
Right. And this is 2021 for those of you listening in the future. Those listening in perpetuity.
Great. So to the people 200 years from now, you can know that one question from the past was, what did you do with the electric bulbs for electrical system? Very interested to...
It's kind of weird that the bulbs, I mean, when you speak about that alone, I mean, when this was designed, it more than likely, they could have been either incandescent or they could have been industrial, like sulfur, phosphorus. I mean, there's a couple of those heavy duty industrials, but now the chic bulb is actually so totally retro. The chic bulb is the Edison bulb,
right?
Which is so even the new very, very energy efficient bulbs have a throwback because you can see the filaments very, very clearly.
That's sort of the point that I was making. Exactly. Right. Yeah. So come on down, check it out. It's very interesting. And Ron, thank you so much for having me on.
Rebecca Uchill, thank you so much. This has been great. And we're going to wrap this up. And thank you for joining us. And once again, you've been listening to the In Focus podcast brought to you by the South Coast Artists Index and graciously supported by Heavenly Spirits Imports. And be kind to each other. And we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
We'll see you next week for another episode of the South Coast Artist Index podcast. The South Coast Artist Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere. Learn more at heavenlyspirits.com. To learn more about the South Coast Artist Index, visit theartistindex.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Be the artist you believe you are, and let's take care of each other out there.